This video is about CSS syntax. So the CSS syntax will let us understand how to properly write a CSS rule. So the CSS syntax is this. First, we have the selector. These are any selectors or any HTML elements you want to style. Then you can also, aside from the HTML element, you can also use other attributes of the CSS of the HTML elements like ID, class, and some user-defined data attributes. So it can be an H1, a paragraph, a div, or an ID. So the next one, it should be enclosed in curly braces. So the first one that you have is the entire declaration or a CSS rule. So the CSS declaration or CSS rule will contain two values. The first one is the property. These are any properties of the HTML elements. You can have a color, a padding, a border, a font family, a font size, and then the right side is the value. So it can be a color name, it can be an RGB value or red, green, and blue value, and you can also a hexadecimal color value. And then do not forget, after each declaration or after any property and value combination, you should put a semicolon. Okay, and then you can add as many declaration or CSS rules to that certain selector. Okay, and then let's have the different selectors that can be used. So the CSS selectors selects this HTML element or elements that you want to style. So different CSS selectors. So these are the simple selectors. These are the selectors that will select the elements based on name, ID, or class. These are also there are also the combinator selectors. They will select elements based on a specific relationships between them. For example, we have here an element that has a child element. Then the pseudo class selectors, these will select the elements based on a certain state. Then we will also have the pseudo elements selectors, select and style a part of an element. And then the attribute selectors, these will select the element based on an attribute or an attribute value. For example, input type whatsoever. Okay, so we will discuss about the CSS element selector. So it is very clear that it will use the element, the HTML elements, based on its name or based on the character enclosed between the less than and greater than symbol. In this case, the paragraph elements will have, if you use this as the element selector, you will not put the less than and greater than symbols, but just P, okay, as we have done in the first video. You can also use the ID of an element. So the ID selector uses the ID attribute of an HTML element to select a specific element. The ID of an element is unique within a page, so the ID selector is used to select a unique element. To select an element with a specific ID, write a hash or a number symbol character followed by the ID of the element. So this is how you use the ID attribute. So applying this to our first example, instead of using the type selector or element selector, so we will use the ID. If you notice, we don't have any ID in our elements. Okay. And take note that IDs are unique to each element, meaning no two elements will have the same ID name. Okay, you cannot do that. But if you want elements to have the same name, you can use a class for that. So let's try to add this first paragraph to have an ID. Let's have here quick. Okay, and then the second paragraph will have the ID hello, and then we'll have an ID for this div, ID whatever. Okay, then the second div, ID another div. Okay, as you can see, though we have two paragraph elements, we have different ID attributes. Okay, this is how you use an ID. No two elements will have the same ID. Okay, now when you style these elements using the ID selector, it will only apply to the specific ID. And how do you style an element using the ID selector? Using the hash before the ID name. Okay, so let's make some changes to our my css.css file. So for the, let's have here view layout, two columns. So we have, okay, then for our element with ID quick, we will style it hashtag, then ID which is quick. Okay, so that's how you use the ID selector. All the code above here are using the type selector or the using the element selector. So let's have here another CSS rule. So we have another CSS rules here above. It will also apply to this element, because the element with the ID quick is also a paragraph, so the paragraph CSS rule will still apply to it. But we have another CSS rule that applies only to this specific element with the ID quick, so this will not affect other elements, other paragraph elements. It will only take effect to this element. Okay. So if we use another styling rule to this element, let's say, let's have here text align. Let's align this to right. Okay, and then let's put another one. Let's have font family. So let's change the font family to have here say consolas. Okay, then you can also set this the font weight. Let's have here the size. Oh, okay, so semicolon, size will be let's say 20 pixels. Okay, so only the element we click will be applied with this CSS rule, which is the text aligned to right. So the text will be aligned to the right, and then this will change the appearance and the size of the text. So let's save all the changes, save all, then let's open this one. Okay, as you can see, okay, as you can see that the text is aligned to the right. Okay, then let's try another font. Let's have here Joker Man. Let's make it even more bigger, 28 pixels. Save all, and then refresh the page. You can see this only applies to this element because we are targeting this element using the CSS selector ID of the element, and it does not apply to the other paragraph element in here. So that's how you use the ID selector. Okay, next is the CSS class selector. The class selector selects HTML elements with a specific class attribute. To select the elements with a specific class, you write a period or a dot character followed by the class name. Okay, so we are going to apply this one to our file. So the class element can be used not only to the same type of element, but you can apply it to multiple elements. Okay, let's try giving all these elements inside this file or inside this page the same class name. Okay, so let's have class equals let's say box. Okay, let's copy this one and put it on all elements. Div. Okay, so as you can see that all our elements inside this page has the class box. And why does it have the same name? Because it is possible using the class attribute. It's unlike the ID attribute, which can only be given to a specific element, because the ID should be unique. Now let us remove this one. Okay, so we will apply a CSS rule to all the elements with the class boxes. Okay, so how do we apply a CSS rule to our elements with class boxes? So you start here with the period or the dot, and then the element the class name, which is box. Then this style will apply to all elements with this class name, which is box. So all box elements will have a padding of, let's have here, let's have 20. Okay, then border 1px. Actually, let's change this to 3. So this will apply to all elements. Okay. Unlike the first one, it applies only to one element, because only one element should have this ID. But using this class name, you will be able to use the same rules to many elements. So let's save this one and then refresh the page. Yeah, and as you can see now, we have the same rules applied to all the elements, because all the elements have a class name box, and then the style that we have added to our class name box is the padding 20 pixels around the text or the content, and then we have a border of 3px, which is a thick black border of the element. Okay, let's try another example. Let's put some so inside this div, inside this div we will put let's have we will use input type elements. So we say label first name, then inside this we'll put the input type text, and then let's change this to actually we'll use the name attribute. So the name attribute of this HTML element will be used for sending data to the server, but for now we won't be able to do that, but we will give it a name, txt first name, and then we will also add an ID, which is very important to identify this element, txt first name. Then let us put here a class text element. Okay, and then let's add a break. Okay, we also have another element. So txt last name, and then we will still use the same element, the class name text elements. And as you can see that the label tag is it contains the input type element. I know that this might be weird to you, but this is very helpful, so I will explain later. So let's make some changes into our CSS file. So we will use the same style to all these text elements. Okay, so we will use this class class name. Let's copy this one, and then let's have here, because we are using the class name, we'll start with the period and then the class name. So we will have a border, let's say 1px solid, then let's try blue, and then the padding, and then let's say 10px, and then we have, let's try margin, let's have here 5px, and then let's try a color attribute to change the color to blue. So the text inside these text elements will be blue. Okay, so let's save this, and then okay, let's save all, then view the result. Okay, now as you can see, the same style is applied to our text boxes. It has a border blue, then the labels also are blue. Why is it? Because this element plus box div, all the div elements will have a color blue. Okay. So that's why the labels automatically turn blue, because this elements is a child element of the div element. So all the rules will be applied to the child elements. So what's the use of putting the text box inside the label tag? So the usage or the goodness of putting that one is when you click on the label, or for example you misclicked, or you click that, so you click the label, and then the text box will have focus. Okay, just like last name, without to click directly on the text box. Okay, so you have seen that I have clicked only the labels, but our text box was focused. Okay, so that's all for this video.